Hello, and welcome to this Whitestorm Lightning tutorial. Today we will be talking about IDs and how objects are identified in Whitestorm. We probably won't be doing too much code today. So let's get started. In Whitestorm, each object has three IDs: a component ID, an object ID, and an ID in general. Now you've probably been exposed to the component and object IDs, but you probably haven't gotten too much of a good explanation of what they are. A component ID specifies what kind of entity we're going to create. So if we have a component ID of 0, we're going to create a pure entity. If we have a component ID of 1, we're going to create a positional. And if we have a component ID of 2, we're going to create a mobile. But we don't know the difference between, say, a mobile that is a spaceship and a mobile that is a UFO. So we have an object ID to tell us that. Finally, we find what particular instance of a object with a component ID of whatever component ID, an object ID of whatever object ID, through the ID. So if we have an object with component ID 1, an object ID 0, the first one would have an ID of 0, the next one would have an ID of 1. If you haven't quite gotten all this or gone too fast for you, don't worry, because you don't have to get it all right now. So let me show you a little bit about object IDs. Let's say we have two objects and both have a component ID of 2. That means they're mobile. The first one we might make the UFO have an object ID of 0, while the spaceship have an object ID of 1. This creates the difference in the engine between the UFO and the spaceship. This makes it easier later on when we talk about IDs, so to make sure we're not talking about, say, a spaceship with ID 0 when we want to talk about a UFO with ID 0. Or so we just don't have one long array of IDs without knowing what kind of objects we're talking about. So we see this object has an object ID of 1 and an ID of 0 down here, ID of 1, ID of 2. So the first one we create is going to have an ID of 0, the second one an ID of 1, and the third one an ID of 2, since we start counting at 0. This object with object ID 0 will have an ID of 0 and an ID of 1 for the next instance that is created. So we haven't quite gone into multiple instances of objects in Whitestorm, but we will pretty soon. So I'd like to show you this. If we go ahead and edit our scripts from last time. Oops. Notepad++. And if we take a look at the entity file, now remember, when you use the toolkit, please enter C: if you don't do anything else. Bad things can happen if you don't. Go to your Whitestorm directory. And I'm going to edit an entity. I'm going to edit our game object entity. Now if we print this, and we take a look for a second, we see that has a component ID of 2. And we see that the editor recognizes that as a mobile. We also see that as an object ID of 0. So we have a mobile, and we can differentiate it, say, from another type of mobile we make, as we see here, by giving it an object ID of 0. Another advantage to this is the engine knows whether or not it will have all of these settings, as opposed to another mobile, referencing the object ID. But notice we don't have an ID in here, because that depends on if we create it. Once we create one of these objects, its ID will be assigned to 0. If we create another one, its ID will be assigned to 1. And if we create another one after that, its ID will be assigned to 2. But if we had another object with another object ID but the same component ID or a different component ID, doesn't matter, it will start out at 0 and then go to 1 for its ID. So now we've kind of looked at that. Let's look at what it says in WhiteStorm. So we know that this is a mobile with object ID 0. We can actually take a look at this from the object. Object get object. Where can get object ID? Sometimes summarize it a bit. Now, this should be 2, 0, 0. Excuse me for a minute. Alright, go ahead and launch WhiteStorm. Yep, I did something wrong. Or did I? Yes, I did. Let's try that. Here we go. That's what I did. So we take a look at the console. We will see we have a component ID of 2, an object ID of 0, just like we see here. And since it is the first instance of the object, we have an ID of 0. And that is your explanation of the ID system in WhiteStorm, which is a pretty unique feature in WhiteStorm. It allows people to easily identify objects, access objects, make manipulations to objects, group objects, etc. I find this a huge advantage actually over a lot of other engines, and it was a large part of the reason of why I made WhiteStorm actually. So, thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe, rate, and comment, and download and experiment with WhiteStorm. I hope to see you in the next tutorial.